When the ranch holds its breath. A slow-burn love story between two young men. The morning, everything changed. Don't go. Two words, that was all. But the way Cole said them, voice cracked at the edge, barely above a whisper, hand hovering just inches from my wrist without actually touching it, stopped me cold in the middle of that dusty barn doorway like I'd walked straight into a glass wall I never saw coming. I turned around slowly. The morning light was pouring in from the gaps between the old wooden slats, cutting gold lines across the hay-covered floor, and Cole was standing there in the middle of all that warmth and shadow, hat in his hands, looking at me like I was something fragile he'd already broken and didn't know how to say sorry for yet. My heart did something I didn't have a name for. Not yet. Let me back up, because this story, our story, didn't start in that barn doorway on a Tuesday morning with the smell of horses and cedar and something electric hanging in the air between us. It started 6 weeks earlier, on the day I pulled my truck up a long gravel road with nothing but a duffel bag, a broken lease agreement back in the city, and absolutely zero plans for the rest of my life. My name is Jasper, Jasper Reed, 22 years old, recently unemployed, freshly heartbroken by a girl who I now realize I was never actually in love with, and the proud new temporary ranch hand at Callaway Creek, a working cattle ranch tucked into the hill country of central Texas, owned by a man named Gerald Callaway who happened to be my father's oldest friend. Gerald had offered me the job in a voicemail that lasted 4 minutes and ended with, "You need the land, son. The land has a way of setting a person straight." I wasn't sure what that meant. I wasn't sure about much of anything that spring. But I loaded my truck and I drove south, and when I crested the last hill and the valley opened up below me, green and wide and ancient feeling, with the ranch house sitting quiet at the center of it all, something in my chest loosened just a fraction. Not healed, just loosened. Gerald met me at the porch. He was 60-something, built like someone had carved him from an oak tree, with silver hair under a sweat-stained hat and a handshake that meant business. He showed me the bunkhouse, showed me the kitchen, showed me where the tools were kept and where the horses slept and where the cattle roamed and where the fence needed mending on the east pasture. And then he said, "My nephew'll be here tomorrow, Cole. He's been running this place with me for 2 years. Good kid, quiet but good." I nodded. I said I looked forward to meeting him. I had absolutely no idea. Cole Callaway arrived the next morning at sunrise, which I only know because I was already awake, couldn't sleep in an unfamiliar place, never could, and I was sitting on the bunkhouse steps with a cup of coffee, watching the sky turn from black to navy to the palest, most impossible shade of pink I'd ever seen. I heard the truck before I saw it, a dark green pickup, older than mine, coming up the gravel road with the headlights still on even though the sun was starting its climb. It parked beside the main barn, the engine cut, the door opened. Cole stepped out. He was tall, that was the first thing I noticed, then the broad shoulders, then the easy, unhurried way he moved, like a man who had never once rushed anywhere because he knew the land would still be there waiting for him. He wore worn jeans and a faded flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and he had dark hair that curled just slightly at the temples from underneath his hat. And even from 30 yards away, I could see that he had one of those faces that was almost unfairly handsome, clean jaw, strong nose, easy to look at in a way that made you want to keep looking. He pulled a bag from the truck bed, turned, saw me. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he lifted his chin in that small, silent, universally understood greeting that men on ranches apparently give each other, and started walking toward the bunkhouse like he'd done it 1,000 times, because he had. "Cole," he said when he reached me, and extended his hand. "Jasper," I said, and shook it. His hand was warm, that's all, that's the whole detail, and yet somehow I remembered it. The first 2 weeks at Callaway Creek were nothing but work. Hard, physical, sun in your eyes, sweat on your back, wake before dawn kind of work. Cole and I fell into a rhythm without really discussing it. He knew the ranch the way you know your own house in the dark. Every corner, every creek, every animal's particular personality, every fence post that had been replaced, and every one that still needed to be. I followed his lead. I asked questions when I needed to and kept quiet when I didn't, and he answered everything plainly and without making me feel stupid for not knowing. We didn't talk much those first weeks, not really. We worked side by side from sunrise to sunset, ate dinner at Gerald's long kitchen table with whatever was in season, and then went to the bunkhouse and collapsed. But there was something in the silence between us that wasn't uncomfortable. That's the thing I noticed most. I'd never been good at comfortable silence with people. I always felt the need to fill it, to perform, to make myself useful with words. With Cole, the silence just was. It breathed. It settled over us like the evening heat and asked nothing from either of us. I found that strangely restful. By the end of the second week, I realized I'd stopped counting the days until I left. It was Gerald who first made us spend a whole day together without a task between us. He declared a Sunday afternoon off, something Cole apparently told me later was extremely rare because a storm was rolling in from the northwest and the cattle were already in the lower pasture and there was nothing useful left to do until the weather cleared. Gerald went inside to nap. The sky turned the color of a bruise. Cole and I ended up on the porch of the main barn with 2 bottles of cold water and the peculiar social awkwardness of 2 people who had been around each other constantly, but hadn't yet had a conversation that went deeper than fence posts and feed schedules. Cole sat on a hay bale near the door. I sat on the other side of the entrance. The storm was still half an hour out, and you could smell it, that particular electric metallic scent that comes before big rain in open country, like the sky is trying to tell you something urgent. "Where are you from originally?" Cole asked, not looking at me, looking at the sky. "Austin," I said. "Well, suburb of Austin, P. Pflugerville." He made a quiet sound, not judgment, just acknowledgement. "City boy." "Is it that obvious?" He glanced at me then, and the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, something smaller than a smile, but warmer. "You hold a fence post like you're scared it's going to bite you." I laughed. It came out louder than I expected, and Cole's almost smile opened up into an actual one, quick and a little surprised, like he hadn't expected it either, and hadn't expected to be the cause of it. He looked back at the sky quickly, but not before I saw it. "What about you?" I asked. "Born here," he said. "Left for a while, came back." I waited. He didn't elaborate immediately, and I was learning to not push. After a moment he said, "Went to college, agricultural science, thought I wanted something else." A pause. "Turns out I just wanted this." He gestured at the land without looking at it. The way you gesture at something so familiar, it doesn't need pointing out. "What else did you want?" I asked. He was quiet for a long moment. The first rumble of thunder rolled in from the distance, low and unhurried. "I'm not entirely sure anymore," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, not sad, exactly, but weighted, that made me feel like that sentence had a longer version he'd decided not to give me yet. The storm arrived 20 minutes later. We stayed on the porch and watched it come, and neither of us said anything else, and the silence was the most comfortable I'd felt in 6 months. After that Sunday, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody said anything. Nobody made a decision out loud. But the next morning, Cole brought 2 cups of coffee out to the porch before sunrise instead of 1 and set mine beside me without comment, and we watched the dawn come up together in quiet, and that became a thing we did. Every morning. Coffee and the sky and the slow awakening of the ranch around us. Small things accumulate. That's the truth nobody tells you about the way a person becomes important to you. It's not one big moment. It's 100 small ones, stacked up so gradually that by the time you notice the weight of them, they've already changed the shape of you. Cole started explaining things about the land without me asking. The names of the hawks that circled the southern pasture, which sections of creek bed held water in the dry season and which went to nothing. The way the cattle moved differently when a storm was still 2 days out versus when one was hours away. He wasn't performing knowledge for me. He was just sharing something he loved, and the generosity of that, the simple, undefended way he opened the world of this place to me, did something to me I wasn't prepared for. I found myself paying attention to him with a kind of focus I didn't apply to most people. The angle of his jaw when he was concentrating, the particular stillness that came over him when he was listening. He was one of the best listeners I'd ever met, the kind that made you feel like what you were saying mattered before you'd even finished saying it. The way he touched the horses, careful, certain, never tentative, always with his full attention, like each one deserved to know they were seen. I told myself I was just observing, learning from someone good at something. I told myself that for a while. 3 weeks into my time at Callaway Creek, we had to ride the north fence line together. It was a full-day job, 12 miles of fence to check, on horseback, through country that got rough and rocky as you moved toward the property's northern boundary where the hills started to bunch up. Gerald gave us a packed lunch and told us not to rush. Cole rode a paint mare named Duchess that he clearly had a long history with. She moved differently with him than she did with anyone else, more settled, like a person who's been told they're loved and believes it. He put me on a steady quarter horse named Atlas, who was apparently Gerald's best horse for inexperienced riders, which Cole told me with such a completely straight face that I genuinely couldn't tell if he was insulting me or not. We rode out at sunrise. The country north of the main ranch was something out of a painting, cedar and live oak climbing up limestone ridges, deer lifting their heads from the tall grass as we passed, red-tailed hawks tracing slow circles overhead. It was the kind of beauty that doesn't announce itself. It just exists, quietly and constantly, and you either slow down enough to see it or you don't. Cole was mostly quiet on the ride out. He checked each section of fence with efficient attention, leaning from the saddle to test wire, dismounting to drive in a loose post, marking spots on a small battered notebook he kept in his shirt pocket. I helped where I could and tried not to be in the way where I couldn't. Around midday, we reached the northern ridge and stopped at the highest point, where you could see the whole valley spread below you like a map of something sacred. Cole pulled water from his saddlebag, and we sat with our backs against a limestone outcropping and ate our lunch and looked at the world below us. "You're getting better," he said. "At what?" "All of it." He took a long drink of water. "Fencing, riding, reading the land." Something warm moved through my chest, high praise from a man of few words. I use the words I need. I looked at him. He was looking at the valley, and the light at that height at midday was extraordinary, sharp and golden, making everything look like it was lit from within. The line of his profile, the way he held himself even at rest, like there was always something inside him that was paying attention. I looked away before he turned his head. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Sure." "Do you ever get lonely out here?" The question was out before I'd quite finished deciding to ask it, and I felt the vulnerability of it immediately. It was more personal than anything I'd asked him. I watched him consider it without rushing, which was one of his particular qualities. He never answered quickly just to fill space. "Yeah," he said finally, "sometimes." He turned the water bottle slowly in his hands. "But lonely and alone aren't the same thing. I don't mind alone. Lonely is something else." He paused. "Less of that lately." He said it quietly, almost to himself, and I wasn't entirely sure he'd meant for me to hear it. My heart made that nameless movement again. We rode back in the long, golden light of afternoon with the shadows stretching east, and Duchess walked close enough to Atlas that Cole's boot occasionally brushed mine in the stirrups, and neither of us adjusted, and I told myself it wasn't anything. I called my mother that night from behind the bunkhouse. She asked how I was doing, and I said fine, which was the word I always used when I didn't know how to say what I actually meant. "Are you eating?" "Yes, Mom." "Gerald feeding you well?" "Gerald barely cooks. His nephew does most of the cooking." A small pause on the line. My mother was a woman of highly developed conversational instincts. "The nephew," she said, "tell me about him." I paused, reaching for an adjective and finding an entire landscape instead. "He's really good at the ranch, at everything here really, quiet, smart. He knows the land like it's part of him." And what?" You paused before you answered, Jasper. You don't do that when you're describing someone you feel neutral about. I'm tired, Mom. We rode 12 miles today. Okay, honey, she said, with the specific gentleness of a mother who has filed something away. After I hung up, I sat on the old fence rail behind the bunkhouse and looked up at the stars, which out here were more stars than I'd ever seen in my life, thick and crowded and terrifyingly infinite. A night bird called somewhere in the cedar. The wind was warm and carried the smell of rain from a week ago that the earth was still slowly releasing. I thought about what Cole had said on the ridge, less of that lately. I thought about it for a long time. It happened during the second big storm of the season, almost exactly a month after I'd arrived. The weather had been building for 2 days. The cattle were restless. The horses were restless. Even Gerald, who was not a man given to visible anxiety, had been unusually quiet at dinner, watching the sky through the kitchen window with the particular expression of a rancher calculating costs he hoped not to pay. The storm hit just after midnight. I'd been asleep for maybe an hour when the first crack of lightning split the sky so close it felt like something physical, a pressure change, a concussion of light through the thin bunkhouse curtains that jolted me upright with my heart already pounding. The thunder followed in less than a second. And then the rain, not a gradual building, but an immediate, total assault, the kind of downpour that sounds like the sky has simply given up containing itself. Then I heard the horses. Even over the rain I could hear them, Duchess in particular, her voice distinctive, high and urgent and frightened. I was pulling on my boots before I was fully awake. Cole was already at the barn door when I got there. He had a lantern, the power was already out, and he was moving with that quiet urgency that he had in a crisis. No wasted motion, no panic, but completely focused. He'd already gotten Duchess into her stall and was moving toward the 2 younger horses that had been spooked into the corner. "Help me with Ranger," he said, not looking up. Ranger was a young bay gelding, barely 3 years old, with wide white eyes and trembling flanks pressed against the far wall of his stall. I slipped in beside Cole, doing what he did, low voice, slow movement, hands visible, no sudden gestures. "Hey, hey," Cole was saying softly, almost under his breath, a steady rhythm of calm. "It's all right, you're all right, nothing's going to get you in here." His voice in the dark, in the middle of all that chaos of wind and rain and animal panic, was, I don't have a better word for it than this, anchoring. He spoke to the horse, but somehow the words reached me too, found something in my chest that was also frightened and also needed telling that it was all right. It took maybe 20 minutes to get all 5 horses settled. By the time we were done, we were both soaked from the open barn door. The lantern was casting warm orange light across the hay and the horse faces and the wet plains of Cole's face, and outside the storm was still roaring like it intended to go on forever. Cole sat down heavily on a hay bale. I sat across from him. Neither of us had the energy to go back to the bunkhouse. The rain was a wall of sound. The horses were breathing. The lantern swayed slightly in the draft. "You did good," Cole said. "You did the actual work. You kept Ranger's left side calm while I got his head. He would have bolted without that." I looked at my hands, still shaking slightly from the adrenaline. "I didn't think, I just did what you did." Cole looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't quite read in the lantern light. "That's its own kind of instinct," he said, "following good sense when you're scared." The storm cracked again overhead. Both of us looked up involuntarily, then back at each other, and for some reason, maybe the adrenaline, maybe the intimacy of having just worked hard together in a frightening situation, maybe just the particular magic of a lantern in a barn in the middle of the night, we both started laughing at exactly the same moment. It came out of nowhere, just the shared absurdity of being 2 very wet young men sitting in a barn in the middle of a monster storm because of the feelings of horses. Cole laughed with his whole face, the way he rarely did in daylight, and it rearranged him, made him look younger and less guarded and completely undefended, and I felt the sight of it like a hand pressed flat against my sternum. We laughed until it faded, and the sound of rain filled back in around us. And then we sat in the quiet, still smiling, not quite looking at each other. And the warmth between us was different from warmth I'd felt before, more particular, more directed, more like something that knew where it wanted to go. "Tell me something," Cole said after a while. "What kind of something?" "Something true, something you don't usually say." I considered a lot of answers. I gave him a real one. "I think this is the first time in years I've felt like I was in the right place. Here, this ranch, I don't really know what that means." Cole was quiet for a moment. "Outside, the rain was beginning to soften, just barely. Means you found something that fits," he said. "Most people don't." "Did you?" He looked at the lantern for a long time. "I'm finding it," he said slowly, still figuring out the shape of it. I didn't ask what he meant. I thought I might know, and I wasn't ready to be sure. We stayed in the barn until the storm broke at around 4 in the morning, talking, really talking, the kind of talking you only seem to do in the dark or in the middle of natural emergencies. He told me about college, the way he'd felt displaced there, too loud and too crowded, surrounded by people performing versions of themselves. The relationship he'd had with someone, he said, someone without gender, that had ended not badly but sadly, the way things end when two people are both good but not right. I told him about my last year in Austin, the job I'd lost, the relationship I'd ended or that had ended me. It was hard to say which. The way I'd been living like I was waiting for my real life to start, without being sure what it was I was waiting for. Cole listened in that complete way of his. He asked 2 or 3 questions that were so precisely the right questions, the ones that lived just beneath the surface of what I'd said, that I looked at him with something approaching astonishment the first time he did it. "How do you do that?" I said. "Do what?" "Ask exactly the right question." He shrugged, a small motion. I listened to what people almost say. I stared at him for a long moment. The lantern was starting to burn low. One of the horses shifted in his stall. The rain was down to a soft hiss on the barn roof. "That might be the most revealing thing you've ever said about yourself," I told him. He looked at me, and something in his expression shifted, the same shift I'd seen on the ridge, subtle and unannounced, like a door that had opened a crack and wasn't quite sure whether to open further. "Yeah," he said quietly, "might be." After the storm, nothing was said, nothing was named, but something was different, and we both knew it, and the knowing existed between us like a weather system, invisible, present, shaping everything around it. We kept our morning coffee ritual. We kept working side by side through the long days, but now there was something added to the ordinary fabric of those hours, a quality of attention that I struggled to describe even to myself. I was aware of him differently, the way you become aware of a sound in a room that's always been there, but that you've only just started hearing. I'd look up from a task and find that he'd been looking in my direction. He'd turn to say something and find me already looking at him. The eye contact lasted a beat longer than it had before. Neither of us said anything about it. Both of us noticed. There is a particular agony in wanting to understand something about yourself that you've never needed to understand before. I had known myself to be one thing, straight, uncomplicated in that particular way, attracted to women in the standard expected way. And now I was sitting with evidence that the map I had was missing significant territory, and I didn't know how to begin to read new geography. I thought about it at night, in the bunkhouse, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling in the dark. I thought about it during the long afternoons in the south pasture when Cole was on the other side of the fence, and I was aware of exactly where he was at every moment without deciding to be. I thought about it with a mix of something warm and something frightened, and something that felt, even in the middle of the uncertainty, quietly, stubbornly like the beginning of honesty. I didn't talk to anyone about it. What would I have said? Gerald's birthday was in late April, and the ranch celebrated with the kind of relaxed, unpretentious gathering that felt very Texas. A few neighboring ranch families, a long table set up outside under strings of lights, barbecue and cold drinks, and the warm evening air that comes at the end of a good day. There were maybe 30 people in the yard, adults and children and working dogs weaving between legs. I'd been at the ranch long enough to be introduced as Gerald's hand rather than his visitor, which felt like a small but significant distinction. The neighbors were friendly and curious and pleasantly unshy about it. Cole moved through the gathering with an ease I hadn't expected. I'd thought of him as someone who preferred quiet, but he was comfortable here, easy with people he'd known all his life, occasionally laughing at something someone said with that full-face laugh that still did something to my equilibrium every time. I watched him from across the yard more than once. I didn't try very hard not to. Midway through the evening, a young woman from a neighboring ranch, pretty, confident, with the specific assurance of someone who has always known exactly who she is, made her way to Cole and put her hand on his arm and said something that made him smile. Not his real smile, I noticed. The polished one he kept for acquaintances. And then I noticed something else. I noticed the difference and that it mattered to me which smile she got. The feeling that moved through me at that moment was unmistakable. It was low and sharp and not particularly pleasant, and it had a name, and the name was jealousy, and recognizing it was like recognizing the shape of a door I'd been standing in front of for weeks without admitting it was there. I went inside for a glass of water I didn't need. Cole found me in Gerald's kitchen 5 minutes later. "You all right?" he asked. "Fine, just warm." I turned on the tap, let the cold water run over my wrist. He was in the kitchen doorway, the sound of the party soft behind him. He looked at me with that focused attention of his, the kind that missed very little. "You went quiet," he said. "I'm allowed to go quiet." "You are." A pause doesn't mean I don't notice. I turned off the tap, looked at him. He was leaning in the doorframe with his arms loosely crossed, and the kitchen light made him look more like himself, somehow more sharply drawn, and I had the sudden overwhelming awareness of how small this room was, how close he was, how much I was working to keep my expression neutral. "The girl you were talking to," I said, and then stopped, because I had no idea how to finish that sentence in a way that didn't immediately reveal everything. Something moved in Cole's eyes, something careful and watching. "Taylor," he said, "Gerald's neighbor's daughter, known her since she was 10. She seemed," I cast around, "interested." "She's always been friendly," Cole said in a measured tone. "It's not like that." "I wasn't saying." "I know what you were saying." The silence that dropped over the kitchen then was the most loaded kind, full of things spoken sideways, things neither of us was ready to be direct about but that were filling up the room like water rising. "Cole," I started. "Don't," he said, not harshly, gently, like he was asking for something rather than refusing something. I closed my mouth. He stayed in the doorway for another moment, and there was something in his face that I would spend a long time afterward trying to name, not withdrawn, exactly, but careful. The way a person looks when they're protecting something they don't yet know if it's safe to set down. "Come back outside," he said finally. "Gerald wants to do the cake." And he turned and walked back into the party, and I stood in the kitchen for another 30 seconds, hands still on the edge of the sink, heart doing everything at once. Something pulled back after that. Not dramatically, not a fight, not a cold shoulder, nothing that anyone watching from the outside would have noticed or named, but I felt it. The morning coffees happened still, but Cole was sometimes back inside before I'd finished mine. The conversations were present but stayed at the surface: the ranch, the work, the weather, Gerald's health, the price of feed. The eye contact that had been getting longer started getting shorter. The particular quality of his attention, which I had started to feel like sunlight, was not absent, just angled slightly away. I told myself I'd imagined the whole thing, that I'd read meaning into shared labor and close quarters and a few nighttime conversations, that I'd blown completely out of proportion with the particular desperation of someone who was lonely and confused and far from home. I told myself Cole was just a private man. I told myself the evening in the kitchen had been nothing. I told myself these things repeatedly and with great effort, and I believed almost none of them. The work kept coming, which was useful. End of April was the beginning of what Gerald called the push, moving the cattle from the lower winter pastures up to the higher summer range, repairing and extending the northern fence line, making sure the water tanks were working, 100 other tasks that kept the body busy and left the mind with less room to circle. I threw myself into it. Cole and I worked well together even in the new, slightly formal distance, because we had built up enough shared language and rhythm that the work didn't require closeness. It just required coordination. But I missed him, that's the honest thing. Even standing 10 feet away from him in a field, I missed the version of him that had sat across from me in a lantern-lit barn and asked me for something true. One evening in the first week of May, I went for a walk after dinner instead of going straight back to the bunkhouse. The evenings were perfect then, warm but not hot, the light going that particular gold going to rose that made the whole country look like a memory. I walked the south pasture fence line without any purpose beyond movement and the company of the evening. I'd been walking maybe 20 minutes when I found Cole. He was sitting on the top rail of the far south fence with his back to me, facing west, watching the sunset, just sitting, still as the fence post beside him. He had a small notebook in his hand, not the work notebook, a different one smaller, and he was writing in it or had been, the pen in his fingers, but not moving. I hesitated, I almost turned back. But he heard my footsteps in the dry grass and turned, and our eyes met, and the expression on his face in that instant before he could arrange it was raw isn't the right word. Unguarded, maybe, for just 1 second, completely unguarded. Then the arrangement happened, and he looked not unfriendly, but normal, surface-level normal. "Evening," he said. "Sorry," I said, "I'll go back." "You don't have to." I stayed. I climbed the fence rail beside him, not close, a few feet of rail between us, and looked west, where the sun was doing the particular extravagance of a Texas sunset, laying red and copper and gold across a sky that went on forever. "What are you writing?" I asked, and immediately regretted asking it because it was too personal, too close. But Cole just looked down at the small notebook. "Nothing useful," he said, "never is." "What does that mean?" He considered. "Means I write things down when I don't know what else to do with them, has never once solved anything, just moves the weight around." I looked at him. He was looking at the sunset again. The light on his face then was something else entirely, all copper and softness, making him look simultaneously more beautiful and more unreachable. "I've been doing that too," I said, "internally, not writing." "What do you do with it?" "Just carry it around, wonder what it means." Silence. The sun was going fast now, the way it does at the last moment, dropping behind the horizon like it had somewhere to be. "Jasper," Cole said, and stopped. "Yeah." More silence. He turned the notebook over in his hands, turned it back. "I don't," he stopped again, started again. "I'm not always good at saying things out loud. Things that matter, I usually just don't." "I've noticed. It's not you. It's not about you doing anything wrong." My heart was going quite fast. "Okay," I said carefully. "I just needed space to think." He looked at me then, directly, and in the last light his eyes were very dark and very serious. "I've been thinking a lot." "About what?" He held my gaze for a long moment. "About what I want," he said. "About whether I know how to want things that feel complicated." His jaw moved. "About whether complicated means wrong, or just complicated." I understood exactly what he was saying. I understood it in my chest before I understood it in words. "I don't think complicated means wrong," I said. My voice came out lower than I intended. "Not usually." He nodded slowly, looked back at the horizon, where the last edge of the sun was gone and the sky was turning from copper to deep violet. "I know," he said very quietly. "I'm trying to get there." We sat on that fence rail until the stars came out, and we didn't say anything else important, and it was enough. June arrived, and with it, the particular oppressive heat of Texas summer that settled on the land like something with intent, heavy, total, the kind that made the air shimmer above the gravel and sent the cattle to whatever shade they could find by midday. The heat changed the ranch's rhythms. Work started earlier, before the worst of it. Midday became the bunkhouse or the cool of the main house. Evenings opened back up as the temperature broke around 7 or 8, and that was when the land was most beautiful anyway, the colors heightening as the heat left, the quality of light going extraordinary. Something shifted again in this period. Gradually, carefully, the distance Cole had put between us began to close. The conversations at morning coffee got longer again. Working side by side, he started talking, not just answering my questions, but offering, sharing, narrating the world of the ranch, and sometimes the world of his own thoughts with the trust of someone who had made a decision and was living into it. He told me things during those long summer evenings, about his family, his parents, who were Gerald's brother and sister-in-law, who'd both died in a car accident when Cole was 15, which was when Gerald had taken him in, about what that had done to him, the way he'd handled grief by making himself useful, which was a habit he'd never quite broken, about the person from college again, this time he used a name, Marcus. Just once, casually, not watching me for a reaction, and the casualness of it was its own kind of courage. I heard the name, and I felt something settle in me, the shape of things clarifying. I didn't make it into a moment. I just listened, and when there was a natural pause, I asked about Marcus the way I'd ask about anyone. What had he studied? How had they met? And Cole answered with the same lightness he'd offered the name with, and we kept talking, and something essential happened in that ease that I think we both felt. Later that night, alone in the bunkhouse, I lay awake and thought about what I knew about myself now, at 22, on a cattle ranch in central Texas, that I hadn't known 6 months ago in Austin. The list was short but significant. I thought about how surprising the self can be, how the truest things about you sometimes wait in patient silence for the circumstances that will let them surface. I thought about Cole and what I felt when I was near him, and I stopped arguing with it. There was an afternoon in early June when we were fixing a section of fence near the creek bed, working in the shade of a big live oak, and the creek was low from the dry week, but still running, and the light through the oak leaves was broken into 100 moving pieces. I was holding a fence post while Cole drove it with the post driver, and we'd been doing this for an hour in comfortable semi-silence, and then the post went in too fast, and the driver came down wrong, and the handle caught Cole's hand between the metal and the wood. Not badly, it didn't break anything, I don't think, but he made a sharp sound and pulled his hand back. I was around the fence post before I thought about it. "Let me see," I said. He showed me his hand. The palm was red along the base of the fingers, the kind of impact bruise that would darken by morning. I took his hand in both of mine to look at it, just to look at it, to check the fingers bent right, just instinct and concern, and we both went very still. His hand in mine was warm. His fingers were long, rough-palmed, marked by the work they'd done. I bent each finger carefully and he let me, and his eyes were on the side of my face, and I could feel the weight of that attention the way you feel sun through glass. I looked up. We were close, close in the way that happens when you're looking at something specific and suddenly become aware of everything else. The 6 inches between us, the quality of his breathing, the particular undeniable thing in his expression that had no other name than what it was. "It's not broken," I said. My voice came out wrong, too low, too careful. "No," he agreed, "not moving." Neither of us moved for a moment that lasted approximately 1,000 years in some internal measurement. I could see the line of his jaw, a small scar near his left temple I'd never noticed before, the absolute steadiness of his dark eyes. I released his hand, stepped back, picked up my fence tool. "Ice it tonight," I said. "Yeah," Cole said. We went back to the fence, but for the rest of that afternoon neither of us talked, and the silence was not the comfortable kind. It was charged and taut and asked something of us that we weren't ready to answer yet. I found out about the letter by accident. Gerald asked me in the second week of June to pick up the mail in town, a weekly run that usually Cole handled, but Cole had taken a truck out to the north pasture for a repair job that morning. I drove the 20 minutes into town, got the mail at the post office, got supplies at the feed store, came back. Among the envelopes was one addressed to Cole in an unfamiliar handwriting, a return address from San Antonio. I gave it to Gerald, who put it on the kitchen table for Cole with no comment. I thought nothing of it. 2 days later, I came in from evening work to find the kitchen empty and the main house quiet, which was unusual because Gerald was normally starting dinner by that hour. I got water from the kitchen, and that's when I saw it, not meaning to, not snooping, just in the normal course of being in the room. The letter, open, on the kitchen table, and beside it Gerald's reading glasses folded neatly, meaning Gerald had read it, and the words visible from where I stood were just a few lines at the top of the page before I looked away. I looked away immediately, but I'd seen enough. The words opportunity and San Antonio, and we think you'd be an exceptional candidate. I stood in the kitchen for a moment with my water glass. Then I went back outside. Cole was quiet at dinner that night. Gerald was also quiet, in the particular way of two people who are not ready to discuss something that both know needs discussing. I watched the weather between them and ate my dinner and didn't ask any questions. Afterward, washing dishes, Gerald said to me, not turning from the sink, Cole's had a job offer, San Antonio, good operation, big, a pause, management level, been 2 years trying to get someone like Cole. I kept drying the plate in my hands. Will he take it? Gerald was quiet for a long moment. Don't know, he said. He's thinking on it. I put the plate away. I went to the bunkhouse. I sat on my bunk and looked at the ceiling and felt the ranch contract around me slightly, like something that had been expanding had just found its limit. I recognized that what I felt at that moment had nothing to do with losing a ranch hand or a good colleague or even a good friend, and everything to do with something I hadn't yet put into words out loud, but that was as real to me now as the ranch itself. Cole and I didn't talk about the letter for 4 days. During those 4 days, I was aware of something happening in him, something working itself out in the long silences, in the way he sometimes went still in the middle of a task and looked at the middle distance before resuming, in the slight new tension around his eyes at morning coffee. I didn't push. I waited and I worked and I let him have the space. But on the 4th night, past 10 o'clock, when Gerald had been asleep for hours and the ranch was all dark and starlight and the sound of the creek, Cole knocked on the bunkhouse door. He had 2 beers. He set one on the table beside my bunk without explanation, sat on the old wooden chair by the door. I sat up on the edge of my bunk. We each opened our beer. The only light was the small lamp by my bed. You know about San Antonio, he said, not a question. Gerald mentioned it. He nodded, turned the bottle in his hands. Good opportunity, he said, like he was repeating someone else's words. Management, better money, growing operation. All of that sounds like someone else's argument, I said. He looked at me sharply, then, despite himself, something in his face loosened. Yeah, he said, it does. So what's your argument? He was quiet for a moment. This place, he said, Gerald's getting older and he won't say it, but he needs help. I know this land. A pause. I have things here I don't want to leave. The beer bottle in my hand was very cold. Things, I repeated. He looked at me. The lamp was between us, warm and small, making the room feel close and private. His eyes in that light were dark and entirely serious and completely open in a way I'd never quite seen them before, all the careful arrangement gone, all the guardedness set down. I'm trying to be brave about something, he said quietly. I'm trying to just say the thing. My heart was going so hard I was certain he could hear it. Say it, I said. The silence lasted the length of an entire breath. I don't want to go, Cole said. Because of you, that's the honest answer. That's the thing I've been trying to say for 2 months. The room was very quiet. The lamplight was warm. Outside, a night bird was calling in the cedar, and the creek was running, and the stars were doing whatever stars do, and I was sitting on the edge of my bunk looking at Cole Calloway and feeling something take root in my chest that I was certain was going to outlast everything I'd ever felt before it. "Cole," I said. "You don't have to say anything back," he said quickly. "I just needed to say it, because I've never been good at saying things, and every time I haven't said something important, I've regretted it, and I didn't want to regret this one." "I'm not saying anything back," I said. "I'm trying to figure out where to start." He watched me, waited. He had learned somehow to wait for me too. "I came here broken," I said, "not dramatically, just off axis, and something here I started again. You," I said, "specifically, you changed something. You showed me things about this place and about myself that I didn't know how to find, and I've been carrying something around for months that I didn't have the right language for because I'd never needed it before." I met his eyes. "But I have it now." Cole set down his beer bottle, stood up slowly, crossed the small distance between the chair and the bunk. He stood in front of me close and reached out, and his hand touched mine, just that, just the warmth of his palm over my hand where it rested on my knee, and I looked up at him, and the thing in his expression was the most unguarded, beautiful thing I'd ever seen on a human face. "Yeah," he said softly. "Yeah," I said. He exhaled slowly, the tension of months releasing in a single breath, and I felt it in my own body like something unwinding. He sat beside me on the bunk, and we stayed like that for a long time in the warm lamplight with the night sounds of the ranch all around us, not rushing anything, not needing to, because we had arrived somewhere and there was no urgency anymore, only the particular sweetness of something finally becoming what it had been moving toward all along. Now let me tell you what I was doing in that barn doorway on a Tuesday morning. It was 3 weeks after that night in the bunkhouse. 3 weeks of things being different, quietly, privately different, not announced, not performed, not worn as any kind of display. Just different in the way that two people are different when they've chosen each other in whatever small and certain way is available to them. Cole had decided not to take the San Antonio position. He'd called them a week after our conversation, and then he'd come and found me in the south pasture and told me, and I'd said okay, and he'd said okay, and we'd both understood what the whole exchange meant and gone back to work. But something was wrong that morning, or not wrong, unsettled, off. The night before, Gerald had sat us both down after dinner and said the ranch was in a difficult position financially, not catastrophic, but real. The drought and the cost of feed and a bad season 2 years running had made things tight, and the truth was that if the summer went badly, if there was another dry stretch, they might need to make hard decisions. He looked at Cole when he said it, and Cole nodded once and looked at the table, and I felt the weight of what that meant, all the sacrifice and rootedness and commitment in Gerald's old face, and the way Cole received it like a soldier receiving news from a commander he'd follow anywhere. After Gerald went to bed, Cole sat on the porch for a long time in the dark. I sat with him, but we didn't talk. Some things need time before they have words. I'd gone to the barn early that morning because Atlas had been off his feed and I wanted to check on him. I spent 20 minutes with him, talking quietly, checking his eyes and his gut and his hooves. He was all right, just something in the air making him restless, the way animals sometimes feel things before people do. I straightened up, looked toward the barn door. The morning light was beautiful, that specific early summer golden light that makes you feel, for the length of a breath, like everything is going to be fine. And I started walking toward it, toward the door, toward the day, with all its uncertainty and all its weight and all its unknown. That's when Cole's voice came from behind me. "Don't go." I turned around slowly. The morning light was cutting gold lines across the hay-covered floor. Cole was standing in the middle of all that warmth and shadow, hat in his hands, looking at me. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. "I was just—" "I know," he said. "I know that's not—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "I just meant in general, don't go, don't leave the ranch when your time's up. Don't go back to Austin or wherever the next thing is." He looked at his hat. "Stay." I looked at him for a long time, at the way he was holding his hat, nervous, both hands on the brim, turning it slightly, the way he never fidgeted except when something mattered completely. at the set of his shoulders, at the directness in his eyes underneath the nervousness, the particular Cole Calloway quality of saying hard things without flinching once he'd decided to say them. "The ranch can't pay another hand through a hard season," I said carefully. "I know that. So what are you asking?" He looked at me steadily. "I'm asking you to stay," he said. "We'll figure out the rest. I need to know you're not already planning to go." The sunlight was doing something extraordinary on the hay and the dust motes and the old wooden walls of the barn. Atlas huffed behind me. Somewhere outside, Duchess made her morning sound. The whole ranch was waking up around us, going about the business of being alive, and I was standing in the middle of it with my heart in my throat, and a man I had come to love looking at me and asking me something simple and enormous. "Cole," I said. "Yeah. I'm not planning to go." He looked at me, then he exhaled slow, full, like a breath he'd been holding since the night before. And then he crossed the barn in 4 steps, and I met him halfway, and he put his arms around me, and I put mine around him, and we stood there in the gold morning light of the barn, holding on. His chin was at my temple. My face was against his shoulder. He smelled like cedar and morning coffee, and this specific person who had taken up residence in my chest 3 months ago and whom I had exactly zero interest in evicting. His hands were on my back, firm and certain, and I felt the whole long summer of almost saying things finally rest, finally put down its weight, finally breathe. We stood like that for a long time. The horses moved in their stalls. The morning light strengthened. The ranch went on doing what ranches do, unimpressed by the human dramas in its midst. "Okay," Cole said finally against my hair. "Okay." "Okay," I agreed. "I want to tell you about the weeks that followed because they matter, not as climax, but as the quiet grace of after." Life at Calloway Creek did not transform into something movie-like. The mornings were still early. The work was still hard. The financial strain Gerald had described was real, and Cole and I both threw ourselves into it with the additional investment of people who know now exactly what they're working for. We mended the north fence in record time. We worked with a neighboring ranch on a cost-sharing arrangement for the summer range. Cole called a contact from agricultural school who knew a conservation program that offered subsidy payments for maintaining native grassland, something the ranch qualified for that Gerald hadn't known about. It wasn't solved, it was managed. That's the ranch version of hope. What I want to tell you about is the texture of those weeks, the way everything had a slightly different quality now, the way the world around you shifts when you're not carrying something alone anymore. Morning coffee on the porch became something else now, something I don't entirely have words for. We'd sit in our usual spots and watch the dawn come up and sometimes talk and sometimes not. And Cole would occasionally reach over without looking at me and his hand would find my arm or my shoulder for a moment and then retreat. And that small thing, that small, quiet, certain thing, undid me every single time. We were still private about it. This was rural Texas, and Gerald was from a generation that had its particular architecture around these things, and neither Cole nor I needed announcements or performances. What we had was real and present and sufficient to itself. It didn't require an audience. Gerald, for his part, demonstrated over those weeks the particular wisdom of a man who has lived long enough to know what matters and what doesn't. He said nothing explicit, but he started making certain things happen, sending Cole and me on the same errands, extending dinner time into conversations that went long past need, occasionally finding reasons to be elsewhere in the evenings. Whether he knew or suspected or simply sensed that something had resolved itself in his household, he offered it all a benign and complete acceptance that moved me more than if he'd said a word. I called my mother one evening in late June. "How are things?" she asked. "Good," I said, and then, because I'd been building to this for a while, really good. She heard something in it, of course she did. The ranch. "The ranch," I said, "and other things." A pause on the line. Then, "Is this about the nephew?" I laughed out loud. "Yes, Mom." Her voice when she spoke again was warm and entirely unsurprised, and so achingly fond that I had to sit down on the fence rail and wait for my eyes to stop doing what they were doing. I knew, she said. From the way you described him, I knew. You didn't say anything. It was yours to figure out, she said. I just wanted to be here when you did. There was an evening in early July, right at the edge of dark, when Cole and I rode out to the northern ridge together for the first time since that midday lunch weeks ago. The summer sky going down was different from the spring sky, heavier, more dramatic, the heat still present even as the light left, the stars beginning to show themselves in the east, while the west was still burning orange and red. We sat on the same limestone outcropping, not quite touching, looking at the valley below. I want to tell you something, Cole said. Tell me. When you first got here, he said, I wasn't looking for anything. I think I had decided somewhere to just not want things that felt complicated, to just work and take care of this place and not, he paused, not look, not reach. And then I showed up holding a fence post wrong, I said. The corner of his mouth. And then you showed up holding a fence post wrong. He looked at the valley. And the annoying thing is that from basically the first morning, from the first time you looked at me across that porch and actually looked, like you were actually seeing something, I knew I was in trouble. From the first morning, I said. Don't let it go to your head. I turned to look at him. He was watching me with a small private smile, and the sky was doing something magnificent behind him, and I thought, this is the thing you can never quite describe to someone who hasn't felt it. The moment when a face becomes the most familiar face in your world and you can't remember when it happened because it happened so gradually that it was already done before you knew it was happening. I know what I want, I said. I didn't when I came here. I want you to know that I know now. He held my gaze for a long moment. Then he reached over and his hand found mine on the limestone. And the warmth of it moved through me like summer itself. Yeah, he said quietly, me too. Below us, the valley was settling into the blue hour. The cattle were small dark shapes in the distant pasture. The creek caught the last light somewhere in the trees. The land, his land, and a little bit mine now, breathed in the long, slow rhythm it had kept for centuries, unimpressed by any individual life, but generous to all of them. We sat on that ridge until the stars came out completely, and then we rode home in the dark, with the horses knowing the way without being told. I'm writing this in October. 6 months to the day since I pulled up that gravel road with a duffel bag and no plan, and stumbled into a story I wouldn't have had the imagination to write for myself. The summer was hard in the ways Gerald warned and easier in the ways that mattered. The conservation program came through. A wet August saved the late-season grass. The cattle sold well. The numbers are not comfortable, but they are survivable, which is what ranches have always been, a bet placed on survival with the full knowledge that the land holds all the cards. I'm officially on the payroll now. Gerald made it formal in August, sitting across from me at the kitchen table with a contract he'd typed himself, which was, if you knew Gerald at all, essentially a declaration of love. Cole was in the kitchen pretending not to listen. Gerald slid the contract across the table and said, "You've earned it." And I thought of everything that phrase contained, the fence posts and the storm and the ridge and the barn and the quiet mornings, and the man in the kitchen pretending not to hold his breath. I signed it. Gerald nodded once, like a verdict delivered, and went back to his coffee. Cole came out of his not listening in the kitchen and sat down at the table and looked at me with that contained, particular, private thing in his expression that I've come to know as his version of everything. "Welcome to Callaway Creek," he said. "I've been here 6 months," I said. "Officially," he said. I shook my head. He smiled. "There are things I've learned from this land and from the people on it that I don't know how to distill into anything neat. I've learned that the self is not a fixed thing, that the person you thought you were is always being revised by the people you meet and the places that receive you and the unexpected kindnesses that arrive when you've stopped expecting them. I came here someone who didn't know himself in some pretty essential ways. I leave being more honest with myself, more patient with the process of becoming." More willing to name things that frighten me, because the namming turns out to be the only thing that ever actually helped. I've learned from Cole that quiet is not distance, that a person who uses words carefully is not closed but precise, that the most valuable things in my life so far have announced themselves gently and then proven to be permanent. And I've learned from this land, from the extraordinary, ordinary, daily, miraculous fact of living close to the earth and its rhythms, that there is a kind of attention that the modern world does everything it can to prevent, and that it's worth fighting for. The attention that notices the quality of light at different hours, that hears the difference in the wind, that reads another person's face with the patience you'd give to a sky full of weather, because people, like weather, are always telling you something if you care to pay attention. Cole and I rode the full north fence line together last week, the same route we rode in March when I barely knew which end of a fence post went down. The country is different in fall, the live oaks still green, but something changed in the quality of the light, cooler and cleaner, the deer showing more movement, the hawks beginning their southward circuits. We didn't talk much on the way out. We didn't need to. We know each other's silences now, the way you learn a terrain, not just the surface but the depth, the places that hold water and the places that run dry, the spots where the ground is solid and the spots where it needs attention. At the northern ridge, we stopped. Same limestone outcropping, same view of the valley below. Different sky, October instead of March, the blue a shade deeper, the clouds more architectural. Cole got off Duchess and walked to the edge of the overlook. I got off Atlas and stood beside him. We looked at the valley. I almost took the San Antonio job, he said. I know. If you hadn't been here, he stopped, shook his head slightly. I'd have done what I always did, decided I could go without the thing I wanted, told myself it was simpler. And now, he turned to look at me. The October light was different from any other light I'd seen on him, cleaner, somehow, more like the real version of him, without any haze of heat or hope or fear between us. Now I know the difference between simple and small, he said. Simple is good, small is just less than you deserve. I looked at him for a long moment. This man who had opened a landscape to me, literal and otherwise, who had waited with extraordinary patience for me to find my own way to things that, in retrospect, had been looking for me all along. You're better with words than you think, I told him. Don't tell anyone, he said. I have a reputation. I laughed, he laughed too. The valley below us caught the sound and held it for a moment in all that space, and then it was gone, and the land went on, and the sky went on, and we stood on that ridge together in October, and I thought, this is the thing. Not the big moments, though those matter. Not the crisis or the declaration or the first terrifying brave namming of a thing that matters completely. Those are the hinge points. But what a life is actually made of, what this story is actually made of, is the 10,000 ordinary moments between the hinge points. Morning coffee and evening fence rails and quiet dinners and horses and hay, and the texture of a person's voice when they've stopped performing and started simply being. I came here broken. I'm leaving, I'm not leaving, I'm staying, I'm home. I came here broken, and the land healed some of it, and the work healed some of it, and Gerald in his gruff and devoted way healed some of it, and Cole Calloway healed the rest in the specific and irreplaceable way that only another person can. Epilogue, the barn door, one last time. It's early morning. The sun is not yet fully up, but the sky is thinking about it, that navy going to indigo, going to the very first pale suggestion of gold at the eastern rim. The ranch is in that perfect pre-dawn silence where everything feels possible. I'm at the barn door. This time I'm not walking out. I'm standing here watching Cole work. He's already in with the horses, doing what he does every morning with that complete and focused gentleness, each horse receiving his full attention in turn, the soft sounds of his voice moving through the barn like water. He hasn't seen me yet. I watch him for a long moment, the way he moves, the certainty in his hands, the way Duchess turns her head toward him when he approaches her stall, the specific trust in that turn, the way an animal shows you in pure body language what a person might take months to say. Then Cole looks up and sees me in the doorway, and his face does what it does. That particular arrangement that I have come to understand is mine, specifically mine, the one he doesn't give to anyone else. Morning, he says. Morning, I say. Coffee's on, he says. I know, I say, I made it. He goes back to the horses. I come in from the doorway and pick up a brush and start on Atlas, and for a while we work side by side in the quiet barn, with the dawn coming in through the gaps in the boards and the smell of hay and horses and this ordinary, extraordinary life around us. The sun rises the way it always does. The ranch breathes. I'm home. And that, my friends, is the story of how a broken city boy drove down a gravel road and found something he didn't know he'd been looking for his whole life. If you felt something reading this, if any part of this story reached something in your chest that wanted reaching, then you already know exactly why I had to tell it. Because some stories are too real to keep quiet. Bell final hook. But here's what I haven't told you yet. 3 weeks after that October morning in the barn, 3 weeks after everything felt settled and decided and permanent, a truck came up the gravel road that neither of us was expecting, and the person who stepped out of it had a history with Cole that I didn't know about, a history that put the previous 6 months in a light I wasn't prepared for. And the look on Cole's face when he saw who it was. I've never forgotten it.
If the story moved you, if Jasper and Cole found their way into your heart the way they found their way into mine, please hit subscribe, drop a like if you stayed until the very end, and tell me in the comments, did you see it coming? From which moment did you know where this was going? Some of you will say the fence post, some will say the storm. I think the trust ones will say from the very first morning when two men sat on a porch with coffee and watched the sun come up and did not feel the need of the fill the silence. That's usually when it starts. Thanks for watching and keep watching for more interesting and VIP stories.